All right, buckle up, everyone. We're diving deep into the 2024 election. And no, we're not just looking at the surface level polls, we're going way beyond that. We're bringing you insights straight from Kyle Kondik. He's the managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball, which, if you don't know, is a highly respected source for election analysis.
Yeah, they're known for their really in-depth analysis.
Yeah.
So we had a chance to talk to Kondik recently, went through all the data with him, and we're excited to share some of those insights with you today.
It's going to be like your cheat sheet to what really matters in this crazy election, because let's be honest, election coverage can get, well, a bit overwhelming. So we're here to break it all down. We'll give you the clear takeaways, the surprising facts, maybe even a chuckle or two along the way.
We're going to try and keep it fun, but informative.
Exactly. So let's jump right in. One of the biggest election myths out there is that high voter turnout automatically means a Democratic victory. But Kondik says it's not so simple.
Right, he actually pushed back on that idea quite a bit.
So help us understand this. How is it more nuanced than just high turnout equals Democrats win?
Well, he brought up the 2004 election as an example. Remember that one? George W. Bush actually won with a higher turnout than in 2000.
Oh, yeah, that's right. So it really is about more than just how many people vote.
It's definitely about WHO those voters are and where they're voting. It's not just about the raw numbers, but the specific demographics and local dynamics at play.
So the question isn't just will turnout be high, but rather which demographics are showing up and what does that mean for each race?
Exactly. That's the key takeaway here. You can't just assume that more voters automatically benefit one party over the other.
Makes sense. Okay, let's talk early voting.
Ah, yes, always a hot topic.
Kondik pointed out that Republicans are actually ahead in early and mail-in voting in some states. For example, in Nevada, there's an 18,000 GOP lead out of about 47,000 votes cast.
Now, before everyone starts panicking, he did say that this doesn't necessarily spell doom for Democrats.
So walk us through this. Why shouldn't we read too much into those early numbers?
Well, for one thing, early voting trends don't always reflect the final result.
Yeah, I remember in past elections, there were times when one party looked strong in early voting, but then things shifted on election day.
Right, and another thing to remember is that early voting isn't just a Democrat thing anymore.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, we're seeing more and more Republicans embracing early voting, especially in states where the party has really focused on building its ground game.
Ah, so maybe those early numbers are more about changes in voting habits than a sudden surge in Republican support.
It's definitely a possibility. To really understand those numbers, you have to compare them to previous elections and look at which groups are changing their behavior.
So are those big Republican groups seeing something that's making them optimistic?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because the Senate Leadership Fund, which is a major GOP spending group, they just unexpectedly jumped into the Nevada Senate race.
Oh, wow. That's a big move. What do you make of that?
Well, the Senate Leadership Fund doesn't just throw money around for no reason.
No, they're known for being pretty strategic with their spending.
Exactly, they're very data-driven. So
Ah.
their decision to invest heavily in Nevada suggests they're seeing something encouraging in the data.
Okay, that definitely adds another layer of intrigue to this whole early voting situation. But we can't forget about the independent voters, right? They're a huge part of the electorate, especially in places like Nevada.
Oh, absolutely. Don't forget, a third of the voters in Nevada are independent.
That's a lot of people who aren't tied to either party.
Right, and that makes them a huge yee wildcard in this election.
So how do they factor into all of this? How do you even begin to predict how independents will vote?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Independent voters are notoriously difficult to pin down.
Yeah, they don't necessarily align consistently with either party. Sometimes they lean one way, sometimes the other.
It really depends on the issues and the candidates.
Mm.
And when the margins between Democrats and Republicans are as thin as they are in many of these battleground states, those independent voters become incredibly influential.
I get it. Every vote counts. All right, let's move on to the blue wall. Sabato's Crystal Ball just downgraded Michigan and Pennsylvania from lean Democrat to toss-up.
Yeah, that was a big headline.
Are we really seeing cracks in what was supposed to be a Democratic stronghold?
Well, it's important to understand why they made that decision. It wasn't just a random guess. They're seeing a bunch of factors that are making those states more competitive this time around.
Like what? Fill us in.
One thing is changing demographics. Some of those traditionally blue-collar areas, the ones that used to be reliably Democratic, they're seeing a lot of new voters who aren't necessarily aligned with the Democratic Party anymore.
So are these voters leaning towards the Republicans, or are they just up for grabs?
It's a bit of both, actually. Some are drawn to the Republican Party's messaging on the economy or cultural issues, while others are just disillusioned with both parties and looking for something different.
So it's less about the blue wall crumbling and more like it's getting a fresh coat of paint, but we don't know what color yet.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, but what about Michigan specifically? I always thought of that as the most reliably Democratic of those swing states.
Well, Kondik did say that if Harris were to lose Michigan, it would be a really bad sign for her overall chances.
Okay, so Michigan is still super important, but what about Pennsylvania? Isn't that usually the state that decides the election?
Pennsylvania is definitely crucial, and that shift to toss up is significant. But it's not always the deciding factor. Kondik actually laid out a scenario where Harris could win both Michigan and Pennsylvania, but still lose the election if other states swing in Trump's favor.
Whoa, okay, so this is going to be a close one, folks. It's all going to come down to those 7 battleground states.
Yep, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, those are the ones to watch.
And Kondik even said you need a microscope to see the differences in the polling between those states.
He wasn't kidding. They're all super close.
So, vibe check time. Who did he think was in a better position based on the current landscape?
His analysis suggests that Trump likely needs to sweep the Sun Belt states, Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. On the other hand, Harris probably needs all 3 of those blue wall states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin.
So, if the blue wall is looking shaky, those Sunbelt states become even more crucial.
Exactly. The stakes just got even higher in those already tight races.
It feels like every vote in those states is going to count double. So, who does Kondik think has the advantage in the Sunbelt?
Well, he did give a slight edge to Trump in the Sun Belt, but he was very clear that nothing is certain at this point.
Right, these races are incredibly tight.
Absolutely, and any number of factors could tip the scales one way or the other.
Okay, so no easy answers there. But he did say you need a microscope to tell the difference in the polling, which honestly makes me a little nervous. Before we get too deep into those swing states, though, let's talk about the House of Representatives. Are there any specific races that might give us an early indication of which way the wind is blowing on election night?
Oh yeah, Kondak highlighted a few bellwether seats in Virginia. These are districts that tend to vote with the winning party nationwide, so they can be seen as early indicators of the overall political climate.
Well, that's interesting. Which races are we talking about?
He specifically mentioned VA 7, which Biden won by 7.8 points in 2020. Kondik says this is a must-hold for Democrats if they want to keep their majority in the House.
So if that district flips red, it could be a sign that Republicans are on track for a big night. What other bellwethers are worth watching?
On the flip side, he pointed to VA 2, a district Biden narrowly won. He said that's likely a must-win for Republicans if they hope to take control of the House.
Okay, so we've got one that Democrats need to hold on to and one that Republicans need to flip.
And then there's NC 1, another tight race that leans slightly Democratic, but could easily go either way.
So it sounds like Democrats are going to be playing a lot of defense early on in the night.
It's looking that way, yeah.
What happens if they lose those key bellwether races? Does that mean all hope is lost?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Kondik also expects Democrats to potentially make gains in New York and California later in the night.
Okay, so there's still a chance for them to bounce back even if they have a rough start?
Yeah, but he did offer a word of caution about New York. Vote counting there can be really slow and unpredictable.
Oh. New York is always a bit of a wild card.
So even if Democrats are ahead in some of those races, it might take a while to know for sure.
Okay, so we've got tight races in the battleground states, nail-biting bellwethers in the House, and New York doing, well, whatever New York does. What about the Senate race? Sabato's crystal ball is currently predicting 48 Democrats, 51 Republicans, and 1 toss-up in Ohio.
Right. That's where things stand right now.
Any insights on that from Kondik?
Well, he seems pretty confident in a GOP Senate win. The real question, he says, is the margin of victory.
So how big could the win be?
He said that if Trump performs well, even traditionally Dem-leaning Senate seats in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin could flip, which could potentially give Republicans a 52 to 54 seat majority.
Wow, that would be a major shift in power. Wait, but isn't there at least a little bit of good news for Democrats? What about Colin Allred gaining ground on Ted Cruz in Texas? Could this be the upset we're all waiting for?
Well, while the Texas race is definitely more competitive than some people expected, Kondik still favors Cruz and expects Trump to win the state comfortably.
So, not a guaranteed win for Democrats, but still a race to keep an eye on.
Definitely. And it's worth noting that the Democratic Senate majority, PASHE, just poured $5 million into Texas, which suggests they see a potential opportunity there.
So maybe Texas isn't a lost cause for Democrats just yet. Are there any other Senate races that could throw us a curveball?
Kondik actually highlighted the Nebraska race, where incumbent Deb Fischer is facing a surprisingly strong challenge from independent Dan Osborne.
Oh, wow. An independent candidate making waves in Nebraska.
Yeah, it's definitely an uphill battle for Osborne, but Kondik didn't rule out the possibility of an upset.
An Osborne win would definitely shake things up. But let's be real, all this talk of tight races and shifting polls can be a recipe for pre-election jitters.
Oh, I know what you mean.
Did Kondik offer any words of wisdom for those of us feeling the anxiety creep in?
He actually had some great advice. He reminded us that no lead is definitive, and polls are snapshots, not predictions.
Right, they're just a glimpse of where things stand at a particular moment in time.
Exactly. And as we've seen in recent elections, polls can be wrong, and tight races are becoming the norm.
So don't get too caught up in the hype.
Exactly. Instead of getting swept up in all the noise, focus on what you can control.
Like staying informed, getting involved, and most importantly, voting.
Absolutely. Those are the things that truly matter.
Great advice. Before we move on to listener questions, though, I'm curious. Given the unpredictable nature of this election, what one factor do you think will be most decisive in the final outcome?
That's a tough one.
I know, right? There are so many factors at play.
Yeah, it's hard to pick just one.
We'll take a second to think about it, and we'll be right back to continue our deep dive.
Well, welcome back. Before the break, you asked what single factor could decide this whole election.
Yeah, it's really hard to pick just one. I keep thinking about those independent voters, It feels like they really have the power to swing things in either direction, especially in those close battleground states.
I think you're right on the money with that. Kondik definitely emphasized how tough it is to predict independent voters.
Yeah, because they don't always follow the traditional patterns.
Exactly. He said that really understanding what they're worried about, what motivates them, is key for both campaigns. It's not always as straightforward as looking at their past votes or demographics.
Right. It's more about tapping into their current mindset. Do you think those bellwether House seats that Kondik mentioned could give us any clues about how independents might be leaning?
That's a really good point. Those super close House races, especially in places like Virginia, often reflect the broader trends.
Yeah. It's like a sneak peek at the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If we see independent voters swinging one way or the other in those bellwethers, it could be a sign of things to come in the national races.
It's like a mini drama unfolding before the main event.
Exactly.
Something else that's been on my mind is how polarized everything feels.
Oh, tell me about it.
It seems like we're living in two totally different realities sometimes, and it makes it almost impossible to have a productive conversation about politics.
Yeah, it's tough.
Did Kondik have any thoughts on how to bridge that divide?
He actually offered some really practical advice.
Go, I'm all ears.
First off, he said it's important to engage with different perspectives, even those that make you uncomfortable. It's about getting out of your own echo chamber and really listening to people who see the world differently than you do.
I get that, but how do you even start a conversation with someone when you disagree on such fundamental things?
Well, he suggested focusing on asking questions instead of trying to win an argument.
Okay, that makes sense.
Instead of instantly going into debate mode, try to genuinely understand where the other person is coming from. Ask about their experiences, their values, the things that have shaped their views.
I like that. It's about building empathy instead of just trying to score points.
Right. It's not always about changing someone's mind, but at least understanding where they're coming from.
But even if we can have those civil conversations, do you really think it's possible to actually change someone's mind? It sometimes feels like yelling into the void.
I know what you mean, but Kondik reminded us that even if you don't change someone's mind completely, you might plant a seed of doubt, or at least gain a better understanding of their perspective.
Okay, I can see that. So we've talked about the presidential race, the House, and the Senate. But what about all those down ballot races? The ones that don't always get as much attention?
Right, those are important too.
Why should we care about those?
Well, even though those state and local elections might not get as much national attention, they have a huge impact on our daily lives. Think about it. They decide everything from education and healthcare to environmental regulations and criminal justice.
You're right. Those things affect us directly.
Exactly. So don't skip those races on your ballot.
It's like missing a chapter in a book. You might miss a crucial plot twist.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's recap what we've learned. We've got close races everywhere, independent voters holding the key to victory, and a deeply polarized electorate. Any final words of wisdom from Kondik before we tackle some listener questions?
Well, he really emphasized that we're in uncharted waters with this election.